Welcome back to lecture number 99, the first historical topic of the last historical period. The topic is 9.1, Contextualizing Period 9. This period of history on the AP exam doesn't really get that much emphasis. It's about 5 to 10% of the multiple choice, despite it being longer in time than Period 8. The learning objective for today is explain the context in which the United States faced international and domestic challenges after 1980. The first key concept picks up where the period left off in politics. A newly ascendant conservative movement achieved several political and policy goals during the 1980s and continued to strongly influence public discourse in the following decades. This is the same conservative movement that had started under Barry Goldwater in the 1964 presidential election. Even though Goldwater lost badly to President Johnson in that election, his ideas became the foundation for the new conservative movement. They inspired a former movie star and young Republican politician named Ronald Reagan. Reagan brings this conservative movement into power after the election of 1980. The electoral map shows that voters overwhelmingly chose Reagan over President Carter. Carter won just a handful of states. One of the ways in which Reagan achieved electoral victory was through appeals to blue-collar workers and blue-collar Democrats. They were reliable Democratic voters going back to the New Deal coalition in 1932. They started to turn away from the Democratic Party partly because of America's standing in the world, the foreign policy, and poor economic growth in the 1970s. Reagan ran on a platform to reduce taxes across the board: income taxes, corporate taxes, capital gains taxes, and estate taxes. The future lecture will cover the rationale behind this and his other economic policies that are sometimes called Reaganomics. Reagan also cut domestic spending. Great Society programs that were designed to end poverty and to create a larger social safety net were getting severely reduced. However, not all spending goes down. Because the Cold War is still ongoing, Reagan increases defense spending. Now, the government was taxing people less, but still spending at similar levels, which creates consistent deficits through the 1980s. In addition to this political and economic conservatism, there was also social conservatism. This entailed taking a traditional stance on big issues like abortion, affirmative action, and same-sex marriage. They were often influenced by religion and the growing evangelical movement. Conservatives disagreed with abortion and the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade. They disagreed with affirmative action programs that were upheld by the Supreme Court decision UC Regents v. Bach. And they opposed same-sex marriage, arguing that it was contradictory to religious teachings. Even after Reagan left office, various states in the U.S. Congress passed legislation that restricted marriage to only unions between a man and a woman. The growth of this conservative movement is somewhat similar to the fundamentalist backlash to modernism in the 1920s. The next key concept says conservative beliefs regarding the need for traditional social values and a reduced role of government advanced in U.S. politics after 1980. This reiterates the political ideology of conservatives. It's exhibited through the Reagan and George H.W. Bush presidency. Reagan served 2 terms and his VP, George Herbert Walker Bush, was elected for 1 term after him. They both added to the conservative majority in the Supreme Courts to influence the court to uphold more traditional social values and reduce the role of government. William Rehnquist, who was originally put on the bench by Richard Nixon, was elevated to Supreme Court Chief Justice by Reagan. The court under Rehnquist put limits on abortion in the decision Planned Parenthood v. Casey. It outlined the acceptable restrictions that can be placed on a woman getting an abortion. Affirmative action is also restricted by the court case Gratz v. Bollinger. It said that a university cannot give an applicant automatic points in the admissions process based on their race alone. Gun rights were strengthened because of the Supreme Court majority in the 2000s. D.C. v. Heller protects the right to bear arms. This decision says one does not need to be part of a well-regulated militia, as stated in the Second Amendment, in order to exercise this right. Then in 2010, it gets incorporated into the states with McDonald v. Chicago. It forbade states from putting burdensome restrictions that could effectively limit the right to bear arms within their boundaries. The reduced role of government that conservatives favored was mostly in regards to regulations and welfare programs. There were moments in which conservative presidents favored a slightly greater role of government intervention. For example, the Brady Act was passed by a conservative Congress in reaction to the attempted assassination of President Reagan. His press secretary, James Brady, was also shot in the incident and nearly died from his injuries. The act that bears his name required background checks and waiting period for all handgun sales, so that no one could get their hands on a gun in a short amount of time and carry out a crime of passion. Another instance in which conservative presidents increased the role of government was when George H.W. Bush signed the American with Disabilities Act in 1990. Think of this as a civil rights act for people who have physical disabilities. A simple example is that it makes sure that people who use a wheelchair for their mobility can get into a building with an accessible ramp, or that they can use an accessible bathroom. Since these were mandated through federal law, they thereby increased the role of the federal government. Another act passed by George H.W. Bush was the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It operates similarly to ADA, but ensures that students with learning disabilities receive a free and appropriate education. It puts the onus on a school to meet that by putting in place individual education plans or IEPs when appropriate. The next key concept moves us closer to the present day. Moving into the 21st century, the nation experienced significant technological, economic, and demographic changes. The internet has been one of the greatest technological changes in the last 30 years. It has sped up the rate of exchange of information and increased economic activity by linking producers and consumers. Related to the internet, there are smartphones and social media. These are different ways in which people use the internet. They have the ability to make people more interconnected, but have also shown negative psychological impacts on youth. A recent Financial Times article cited a strong correlation between the use of smartphones and depressive symptoms among teens. The last and most recent technological development is machine learning or artificial intelligence. With the collection of knowledge stored on the internet, companies have put their computing power to create platforms that are better able to synthesize large amounts of information and to identify patterns. A common theme amongst all of these new technologies is that they are extremely accessible to the average American. The new technologies will impact the nation's economy. There was a decline of manufacturing in the United States, also partially created by the NAFTA trade agreement. The new, more common jobs are those in the service and information sectors. The latter will more often require a higher level of education achievement like a college degree, therefore having higher pay. Those who don't have college educations or greater skills take up lower skilled service industry jobs that leads to a growing wealth gap. Throughout this entire historical period, those who are wealthy continue to increase their wealth, and those who are not wealthy continue to have limited opportunities for economic mobility. The Great Recession started in 2007 and 2008 in the housing industry, when banks were giving out risky mortgages because investment banks would buy them off their books at a high price. It created a speculation bubble that eventually crashed and created several years of high unemployment. The pandemic recession happened in the year 2020. The coronavirus outbreak forced every state in the country to issue stay-at-home orders that disrupted economic activity across the whole country. Part-time workers were let go and many small businesses failed. The government's response in both of these was to implement various stimulus programs to restart economic growth. In the case of the 2020 recession, it ultimately led to a resurging labor market but higher inflation levels. There were demographic shifts in domestic and international migrations. The internal migration was from the Northeast and the Midwest to the South and the West. This migration to the Sunbelt is a continuity from the previous time period. People were drawn to the warmer weather and usually lower taxes in these states. The international migration was also a continuity from the previous period. The resurgence in international migration, made possible by the 1965 Immigration Act, continues and nearly reaches the pre-1920s levels again. Today, about 17% of the U.S. population is foreign-born. The next key concept delves deeper into technological changes. New developments in science and technology enhance the economy and transform society, while manufacturing decreased. In this historical period, the economy shifts to what's called tertiary and quaternary economic activities. These are jobs in service and information industries, as the name suggests. Information industry jobs usually require a greater level of education and are usually higher paying jobs. Since a college education is out of reach for many Americans due to the cost of it, the wealth gap continues to grow. Companies in this sector that experienced the greatest growth were in the tech industry. Silicon Valley in California got its name from all of the tech companies that are headquartered there. Silicon is the material that computer chips and circuit boards are built on. Examples of companies in Silicon Valley are Apple, Google, Intel, Cisco, and Oracle. Simultaneously to the rise of the tech industry, the manufacturing industry decreased. Outside foreign competition made finished goods cheaper to import, rather than to produce domestically. This trend started in the previous historical period with Japanese cars outcompeting American-made cars. In this historical period, the trend expands to all other consumer goods and textiles. They are imported from East and South Asian countries where labor is much cheaper than in the US. In this period, it becomes even cheaper to import these goods with the rise of free trade agreements the US enters into, which take away import tariffs on incoming goods. Organizations like the World Trade Organization were created with the intention that countries engage in free trade fairly. That means that no one country artificially lowers prices to gain an advantage, and that countries implement fair and safe working conditions for their laborers. The next key concept goes into more detail on the demographic changes of the period. The US population continued to undergo demographic shifts that had significant cultural and political consequences. The migration to the Sunbelt had a political effect. The increase in population in a state leads to their growing significance in elections. Every 10 years, the census is taken, and then representation in Congress is reapportioned to match population growth in various regions. States with greatest growth are awarded representatives in Congress at the expense of states with shrinking populations. This translates into more electoral votes in presidential elections. One of the cultural consequences of resurging international migration is cultural blending. As people move to the United States, they retain their own cultural practices that are sometimes adopted by or infused into American culture. It's the old melting pot analogy for immigration. The impact is easily seen in food. In the Southwest, there's a large amount of Mexican or Hispanic restaurants that are not exclusively frequented by Mexican immigrants. Some of this cuisine can be blended into others and yield fusion styles like Tex-Mex. The same pattern is true for Chinese restaurants, Japanese restaurants, or Asian fusion restaurants. The continued immigration also increased the use of languages other than English. For example, Spanish is more frequently heard in the South and Southwest. Religions like Catholicism experienced a rise due to Latin American migrations, but there was also growing numbers of Buddhist temples or Muslim mosques. Through this entire period, more people crossed the US-Mexico border without proper documentation, and there continues to be division on how to handle the incoming migrants. In the previous period, the 1965 Immigration Act for the first time put a cap on the number of immigrants from countries in the Western Hemisphere. Once that cap was reached, people have to either wait for the next year or the year after, depending on how many people are waiting. To get around the filled cap, some cross either through an unregulated land border or they're able to get on a plane and then overstay their visa. In this period, the number of people in the United States without a valid residency visa grows to an estimated 10 million people. The debates on how to deal with people who are living in the United States and are undocumented play out almost every election cycle. During the Obama administration, the president issued an executive order called the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, also called DACA. As the name suggests, it promises that the U.S. will not deport any undocumented migrants who came to the United States when they were children. Migrants had to self-identify and then they were allowed to stay in the United States, work, and pay taxes, but they won't be able to receive any social safety net benefits. The Trump administration tried to end the program through an executive action and resumed deportations, but was stopped by the judiciary. President Trump also went through several iterations of an immigration ban that mainly targeted Muslim countries, as he framed them as enemies harboring terrorists. Eventually, the ban was expanded to include non-Muslim countries and was upheld in the 2018 case Trump versus Hawaii. The debates around immigration are a clear continuity from the early 20th century to the present, especially as the federal government navigates the question of who can come to the United States. The next key concept says the end of the Cold War and new challenges to U.S. leadership forced the nation to redefine its foreign policy and the role in the world. The first challenge after the Cold War was over was to dismantle all the weapons that were accrued as a result of the arms race. George H.W. Bush signed the START I and START II treaties with Russia to try and reduce the number of nuclear warheads in 1991 and 1993. However, just because the Cold War was over, it did not mean that the U.S. was done with its large role in the world. In 1990, the United States led a multinational coalition into Iraq to stop their invasion of the country Kuwait. Allegations of genocide in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 90s also prompted multilateral invasions led by the US and the UN. The United States kept its leadership role in the world by virtue of its military and economic might. However, now the Soviet Union wasn't around to counter it. In the early 2000s, the United States adopts a new foreign policy objective that's implemented in a similar way to its anti-communist containment policies of the Cold War. This was the war against terrorism that started in response to the 9/11 attacks. On September 11, 2001, members of the terrorist group Al-Qaeda hijacked planes in the United States and flew them directly into the World Trade Center towers in New York City. One plane crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and a fourth, which was headed towards the White House, was shot down over a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Al-Qaeda's motivations were stated by Osama bin Laden in a 2002 letter to America. He cited the U.S. continued support of Israel, military presence in Saudi Arabia, long-standing sanctions against Iraq, and U.S. support of countries waging war against Muslim populations. He also added a broader American immorality and debauchery charge. The president at the time, George W. Bush, tried to simplify this to get more domestic support for the war on terror with the phrase, "They hate us for our freedoms." In response to the attacks, the U.S. invades Afghanistan and overthrows the Taliban government, which had implemented a harsh regime with strict moral codes at the end of the Soviet invasion. They were giving refuge to the terrorist group Al-Qaeda and their leader Osama bin Laden. In 2003, the U.S. invades Iraq over allegations by the Bush administration that there were ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, and that Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The second Middle Eastern invasion makes U.S. allies weary of continued intervention. Nevertheless, the United States kept their leadership position in the UN Security Council and in NATO. The G8, or the Group of Eight, was also a new diplomatic group that emerged in the 21st century that was composed of the 8 largest economies in the world. Their leaders get together every year to discuss common issues and plan for the future. The second to last key concept goes deeper into foreign policy of the 1980s. The Reagan administration promoted an interventionist foreign policy that continued in later administrations even after the end of the Cold War. In 1983, Reagan props up the pro-US governments in Grenada. This is similar to the various actions of containment in the previous historical period. It was considered a success because there was very little residual violence at the end of it. The US continued its interventionist foreign policy in the 1980s, but doesn't always escape public scrutiny. Under the Reagan administration, the United States was selling arms to Iran to aid them in the Iran and Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. Diplomacy changes quickly in Iran, going from US hostages in Tehran in 1979 to helping free US hostages in Lebanon. The United States was also sending aid to the Contras in Nicaragua, who are anti-communist forces or rebels that fought against the Marxist Sandinistas. In 1985, Congress passed a law to stop any aid from the U.S. to the Contras because of all the violence, a side effect of the aid and weapons that the U.S. sent earlier. The Reagan administration continued to send aid, but in an indirect way to skirt the letter of the law. They continued to sell weapons to Iran, but now the profits from the arms sales would go to the Contras. The U.S. intertwined these two conflicts. It became a huge scandal because Congress had passed a law that said that the aid to the Contras was to stop. It turned out that someone in the Reagan administration that was not directed by the president had been one to come up with the idea. Whether or not the president was aware is still debated, but at the time, the American people didn't place blame on the president. The last key concept covers the foreign policy of the 21st century. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, U.S. foreign policy efforts focused on fighting terrorism around the world. The war on terror began in Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban, who had been harboring Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The United States attempted to implement a democratic government in Afghanistan and eventually did find and kill Osama bin Laden in 2011. At the time, he was hiding in a compound in Pakistan. In the last 5 years of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, terrorist attacks led by the Taliban kept the U.S. from leaving for fear that the Afghan government would fall. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. negotiated their exit with the Taliban, leaving the Afghan government out of the talks for withdrawal. When the U.S. finally left, the Taliban quickly retook the country, putting the various democratic and human rights reforms from the last 20 years in peril. George W. Bush claimed that Saddam Hussein in Iraq was aiding terrorism and possessed weapons of mass destruction. The Iraq War deposed Saddam Hussein, he was tried for war crimes, and a new democratic government was put in place. But today, there is a loss of popular support for the Iraqi government because of the last 20 years of warfare, violence, and corruption in the new government. Poor economic growth, unemployment, and violence have kept the country from moving on. In the early 2010s, a new terrorist group preaching a radical view of Islam attempted to fill the power vacuum from the weak government in Iraq and neighboring Syria. ISIS, or sometimes referred to as ISIL, stands for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State in the Levant. Through an increase of U.S. troops coordinated with the Iraqi military, the country was able to successfully root out ISIL out of Iraq. One group of people that were particularly helpful in the fight against ISIL were Iraqi Kurds. They were an ethnic group concentrated in the north of Iraq and who experienced an attempted genocide under Saddam Hussein. They were nearly self-sufficient in expelling ISIL from northern Iraq, which renewed calls to create an independent Kurdish state. The war on terror has subsided from its height in the early 2000s. The resources and its sacrifices spent on Iraq and Afghanistan made the U.S. less likely to involve themselves in other conflicts, even if the rationale seems sound. For example, the U.S. chose to limit their aid to Syrian fighters trying to overthrow the authoritarian president Bashar al-Assad. Even in another Arab Spring movement in North Africa like Libya, the United States limited its involvement to its NATO participation. Even today, the U.S. takes a position against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but limits its aid for fear of escalating the conflict into a bigger war. Finally, here's the recap. The conservative movements came to power in 1980 with Reagan's election. Conservatives generally wanted government's role to decrease. Technological changes impacted the economy, and demographic changes impacted cultural and politics. The U.S. continued to be deeply involved in other countries as part of its Cold War policy and beyond, and the U.S. had to find a new purpose in its foreign policy after the Cold War ended. That came in the form of the war on terror that became the new foreign policy objective after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit APUSHslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.